Thank you, all of you, for coming. It's a real pleasure to be here, and it was a real treat to meet Kate and Ben, and thank you for coming especially. So, I also would like to recognize the Musqueam First Nation, one of the Central Coast Salish peoples whose territory we are today, and who've lived here for thousands of years and cared for these lands. And so it's always a pleasure to think about the long-term habitation of this landscape. A lot of changes have taken place even in the last, well, how many years? 5, 10? Seems like just that since I was here as a graduate student, but it's actually quite a few years. I've been amazed at how the campus has grown, but although it's grown, I see lots of really good ways that it's grown. For example, the main mall is now converted into a pedestrian mall where you can go and, enjoy trees and grass. And before it was all paved over. So that's just one example of these catchment areas for water coming from the buildings. That's another, I think, a real improvement. I wish I had time to tell you about all the amazing people who've been my teachers, other than Roy Taylor himself and a lot of my academic mentors, Wilson Duff and Peter Raven himself, who was one of the people who kind of got me interested in folk taxonomies, which is one of the topics of my research. But I've also had the incredible fortune of becoming friends with and a student of many wonderful and knowledgeable people in different First Nations communities around British Columbia and beyond. And these are just a few of them here. Florence Davidson from Masset, from Haida Gwaii in the top corner. The Locke, Ida Jones from the Dididat Nation. Looking at a pan with high bush cranberry juice in it. Helen Clifton from the Gitgat Nation. My friend, our friend Dr. Richard Atleo, Umik, at his territory of the Atleo River in the Clayoquot Sound, watching the mouth of the river. Chief Adam Dick, Clan Chief Adam Dick Kwak-Sistala from the Kwak Nation. And finally, my friend and sister Seshama, Joan Morris from Songhees, who was born and raised at Chess, and I'll mention Chess in a minute. So these are just a few of many, and I'll probably mention a few of the other ones who've been my teachers. But I also want to acknowledge the wonderful work that the UBC Botanical Garden has been doing, and want to acknowledge Peter Wharton and the legacy that he left for the gardens and for the people of British Columbia. All of the wonderful director, the associate director, Dr. Taylor, you've all kept the gardens going in a really good way, and it's just such a pleasure to see how they've not only been sustained since the time I was there as an undergraduate student, but they've really flourished under your leadership. I'm fortunate to hold the Archive Chair in Ethnoecology at UVic, thanks to Dr. Peterson and Christina Monk. And my husband Bob is here. I call him my personal photographer, but he's a lot more than that. And so, yeah, he was here as a graduate student as well at the same time. So we'll be coming up for 44 years of being married. I also wanted to acknowledge one of our dear friends from that time, Chris Marchant, who passed away this last year rather suddenly. We got a card from his wife, and we felt really sad. But I loved Chris dearly, and he was an expert in a lot of things, but especially fritillarias. And it was, I guess, a little bit of a contrast of approaches, because I was talking about fritillaria a lot. I was learning about it as an edible plant. And for Chris, I think that was a little bit horrific to think about eating this amazing and rare plant. But I think if I could talk to him now about it, I think he would see that the methods and techniques that people use to actually harvest and disseminate the plant made it a kind of a perpetual production system, and that actually not only was it not harmful to eat fritillaria, but it actually promoted the growth of fritillaria. Anyways, we remember him with great affection. So tonight I'm just going to tell you a little story to begin with about the first Europeans arriving on the area that we now call Victoria. Talk about the human-nature divide and the age of conservation, a little bit on wilderness, and then talk about cultural diversity and how it's reflected in people's knowledge, practice, and belief in different parts of the world, and how I believe we've come to a point where we're getting out of balance with our ecosystems, and how we might be able to think about, getting ourselves back into balance. So that's more or less what I'll be talking about tonight. I'll just point out the first salmon ceremony in the bottom photo was being revived after years of not recognizing the first salmon. The Sayote Nation, one of the Saanich nations on Vancouver Island, held a seafood festival, and the children were brought into the ceremony and taught the meaning behind the catching of the first salmon, bringing it to the elders who cooked it and then divided it amongst everyone. In the original time, when the first salmon ceremony was an active part of people's lives and fishing, they ceased fishing for 4 days after they caught the first salmon. And then they had this ceremony and nobody was allowed to fish. And so essentially it was a conservation measure for the salmon, because it ensured that for 4 days the salmon whose runs were starting to go through the Rosario and Harrow Straits on their way to the Fraser River would have a chance for lots of them to get through before people started to fish them for their winter food supply. And the top photo is a blue camas, Camassia quamash, up on the top of Mount Tolly in Victoria. So this is a little story about the first Europeans. When they came to what is now Victoria, they were absolutely amazed and astounded at its beauty. And this is quoting from Captain George Vancouver, 1790. I could not possibly believe any uncultivated country had ever been discovered exhibiting so rich a picture. Stately forests, pleasingly clothed its eminences and checkered its valleys, presenting in many ways extensive spaces that wore the appearance of having been cleared by art. And I put the picture of Chess there, Joni's birthplace, because it's actually named after Captain George Vancouver's ship, Chatham Island, and Discovery is the island with it. So they're both called Chess in the Songhees language, right off Oak Bay. And another newcomer, a little bit later on, James Douglas, who is working for the Hudson's Bay Company, came to check out the area to see if they could build a new fort there, because Fort Vancouver, further south, was being inundated by the Americans. So he stepped off the shore at a place called Clover Point, and he talked about a large tract of clear land which extends eastward to Point Gonzalo, that's Gonzales, at the southeast extremity of the island, and about 6 miles interiorly, so about up to where the UVic campus is now, being the most picturesque and decidedly the most valuable part of the island that we had the good fortune to discover. There's an old Hudson's Bay Company map there, and the bottom picture shows what sort of a picture of what the area is now, if you can imagine it without the houses all over in amongst the oak trees. So James Douglas founded Fort Victoria in 1843, the year after he came up to survey it. And he became the governor of the Crown Colony of British Columbia and became Sir James Douglas in about a decade before he passed away. He was buried in Ross Bay Cemetery in Victoria. So a little bit more from his writing. There's a lot that he's written in what are called the Fort Victoria letters and in other letters that he's written. But he's talking about this area again, a range of plains nearly 6 miles square containing a great extent of valuable tillage and pasture land equally well adapted for the plow or feeding stock. See where I'm getting with this? He sees this amazing landscape that they're just astonished at, but they're looking at it from the perspective of someone who wants to cultivate it, wants to change it and make it conform to their idea of what a landscape should be. And as he stepped off at Clover Point, he saw 2 places particularly. There are several acres of clover, growing with a luxuriance and compactness more resembling the close sward of a well-managed lea than the produce of an uncultivated waste. So that, again, kind of says where he's coming from. To him, something that's not cultivated or managed by humans is waste. And all he could see was, wow, knee-deep in clover. He talks about walking knee-deep in clover. This is our native trifolium wormsioldii. And he sees cows there. He sees farms there, you know. He likes the clover, but only for what it reflects in terms of the potential of the land. And so, in a sense, these few passages and other ones that I think pull out as well kind of reflect the divide between humans and nature that Douglas and Vancouver and many others see, or just that's the way they look at the world. And they're somewhat complex and conflicting perspectives. Obviously, people rely on nature, but they consider themselves to be above nature, superior to nature, and able to control it, and that's the way they look at the landscape. And you can see that kind of perspective in a lot of parts of the world where Europeans have come. So that's, if you look at the roots to that kind of perspective, you can take it right back to Christianity and other earlier documents too. And this is only one version, but it is the Genesis. God said to the people, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens and over every living thing that moves on the earth. So that was taken as our right as humans to be superior to and dominate and control all the other species in the world. And that was carried on right through the millennia. Here's John Locke, 1690. God gave the world to man in common. I won't comment about the gender there, but since he gave it to them for their benefit and the greatest conveniences of life they were capable to draw from it, it cannot be supposed that he meant it should always remain common and uncultivated. He gave it to the use of the industrious and the rational, and labor was to be his title to it. And it wasn't by chance that I picked Mr. McGregor's garden there, with Mr. McGregor working very hard in his garden, very well-managed garden. My favorite movie, I have to admit it, is The African Queen. And I always anticipate this line from Rose, who says, nature, Mr. Allnut, is what we were put on this earth to rise above. But of course, it's much more complicated than that. And there were a lot of people who did really appreciate the values of nature in a natural world. For example, John Muir, he wrote in glowing terms about the intrinsic values of nature. Climb the mountains and get their good tidings. Nature's peace will flow into you as sunshine into trees. Very poetic writer, and is famous, especially associated with Yosemite National Park, but also he was instrumental in the entire national park system and in the whole notion of, I guess, interesting people in the idea of wilderness. Just have a look at the photo from Yosemite there, and look at the valley bottom, because I'm going to show you something later on. And there were many, many others. Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, Aldo Leopold, and most recently maybe Rachel Carson, all of whom saw a tremendous value and appreciation of the natural world and the other species, and worried about what we were doing to these other species and habitats. Then there were people with a more utilitarian approach, like Gifford Pinchot, or Pinchot, never figured out which way to say it, who was the first chief of the U.S. Forest Service, and he established the U.S. National Forests, and he coined the term conservation ethic. And he called forest management, he defined forest management, applied to, the art of producing from the forest whatever it can yield for the service of man. So he was he appreciated wild areas and nature and wilderness, but he also had this notion that nature was there in the service of man. And so wilderness became part of this human-nature divide. And with the establishment of the national parks, Yellowstone, Banff, Yosemite, they became, quote, a new way for people to preserve and protect the best of what they had for the benefit and enjoyment of future generations. So there was an appreciation of wild areas in nature, but it was still very much an us versus out there. We're not really part of that world, but we appreciate parts of it anyway, to a certain extent. In 1964, when I was still in high school, the Wilderness Act was implemented in the U.S. A wilderness, in contrast with those areas where man and his own works dominate the landscape, is hereby recognized as an area where the earth and community of life are untrammeled by man, where man himself is a visitor who does not remain. So that's the kind of underlying philosophy of the national parks. But then we have E.O. Wilson, who, not alone, but he's known as the father of biodiversity for a good reason. He thought a lot about biodiversity, and he drew his ideas from his studies as an entomologist. He was an ant specialist, and there's one of his papers from 1964, The True Army Ants of the Indo-Australian Area. He was a taxonomist, and through his work in taxonomy, he got the idea of how important each and every little species and subspecies is in the whole scheme of things, in the whole complex web of life, and the dangers of simplifying those ecosystems. Those are not real ants. So the definition, the simple definition of biodiversity, the variety of life and all its forms and combinations. So it's recognized that it is at different scales, that biodiversity is important at the genetic level. An organism's DNA across to species, numbers of species and varieties and combinations of species, as well as at broader landscape and ecosystem habitat levels. And then I throw in a personal touch here, because before E.O. Wilson, I'm proud to say, my grandfather was an ant taxonomist who studied ants in the Philippines, and he got his PhD at Harvard, and I was told recently that E.O. Wilson based his PhD dissertation on my grandfather's ant collections from the Philippines. There is my granddad and my grandma, and my dad is the little kid, the littlest kid sitting on his mom's lap there. My dad became an entomologist as well, so I have a good kind of family feel for this idea of biodiversity, entomology, and so forth. So back to Victoria. So I guess you've probably figured it out by now that I was going to reach this point to say, wait a minute, these guys are looking at this landscape. They didn't have a clue that it was, in fact, an anthropogenic landscape, that it was maintained by the first peoples there in a very careful, systematic way, using fire and other means to maintain a mosaic of prairies and Gary oak woodlands, the camas that people relied on, and actually, when you counted out, harvested it by the tens of thousands. I figure about 10 million camas bulbs a year were taken from southeastern Vancouver Island at the time that people were harvesting camas on a yearly basis for sustaining their communities. It was called the #1 root of this climb. It was like, it was eaten to the same extent that we might eat potatoes today. Had to be pit cooked. But, and along with the camas, they were also managing for deer, for game, and for berries like strawberries. Apparently strawberries were so abundant around Victoria that people were gathering them by the gallons and preserving them back in the late 1800s. And now you can hardly see a single one. Trailing blackberries, Rubus ursinus and Rubus leucodermis, the black cap, all of those were berries that were managed by this intentional clearing and burning. So, it wasn't just for southern Vancouver Island that this was true. All over North America, South America, Australia, New Zealand, almost everywhere around the world, people, local people, were managing, maintaining their ecosystems in this way. And for example, in Yosemite, the Miwok and the other First Nations of the area depended on the valley for producing acorns, and they harvested black oak acorns there in huge quantities. This, the spot with the holes in the rock is an acorn grinding place very nearby Yosemite. And they managed Yosemite, the valley bottom, again using fire. So look at that valley bottom sketch from 1855. There's hardly any conifers there. And it was mostly oak, and a combination of prairies and oak woodlands with a few conifers, a few of the giant sequoia and juniper there, but not nearly to the extent that came in after fire was suppressed and people were excluded from that environment. And so, all over Vancouver Island and all over, there were communities of thousands of people who were living on the resources of areas, moving seasonally around their territories out to islands, and looking after the plants and animals that they needed to harvest for food, developing systems of maintaining and sustaining and conserving those things even as they use them. For plants, there are, well, about 250 species that have that are named or have specific uses and applications as food, materials, medicines, or in ceremonial ways. And a lot of these were very, very carefully harvested. If they hadn't been, they would have declined. And there wouldn't have been very much camas if people didn't know how to maintain it, or rice root, or fritillaria, or salmon, or any of the other things. They had the technology to eliminate the salmon runs up and down the coast. through their fishing weirs and traps, but they didn't do that. In fact, when the Europeans came, they were faced with an immense abundance of all of these things. And it's sort of ironic that the indigenous peoples here are called, quote, hunter-gatherers, with the implication that they were just, you know, plucking this and that, opportunistic harvesters of whatever they came across. Nothing could be further from the truth. They were very sophisticated managers of their resources. Going back to trifoliate Marchant, one of my very favorite plants. Bob can tell you I have windowsills up in our place on Protection Island that I'm growing out, and I have this dream about restoring clover to Clover Point. There's none of that clover anywhere around Victoria now, but I think it needs to get back there, even if it's only at Ross Bay Cemetery. But you can see from the herbarium collections that it used to be common all around the Victoria waterfront, and it was knee-deep, that some of the specimens in the herbarium have to be folded because they're so tall. They had to be put on the herbarium sheet, they had to be folded. So this is one of the ones that people used to eat. Some people call it Indian spaghetti, and it's got a long rhizomes that taste a little bit like bean sprouts rather than spaghetti, but they were bundled and pit cooked. And here's an excerpt from Edward Curtis, 1915. Clover plots talking about the quaquaquil have been in the family for many generations. These hereditary possessions cannot be sold nor given away. To do so would rob unborn descendants. If an owner does not choose to harvest her clover roots, nobody else would touch the ground. Clover land is very valuable because the roots are regarded as indispensable to good health and hence can readily be sold at a high price. For this reason, the land is well cared for. The main root stocks are never taken, and such pieces as are not deemed good for food are put back into the ground. That's just, you know, one example of dozens that I could provide of how people looked after these different plant resources. And yet we have, Bob and I went by Trutch Street here, and we have a Trutch Street in Victoria, but Joseph Trutch was really blind to all of this, like a lot of the other newcomers. I am satisfied from my own observation that the claims of Indians over tracts of land on which they assume to exercise ownership, but of which they make no real use, operate very materially to prevent settlement and cultivation. And Gilbert Malcolm Sproat, who later became the Land Commissioner. We often talked about our right as strangers to take this possession of the district around, he's talking around the west coast, Port Alberni. The American woodmen considered that any right in the soil which these natives had as occupiers was partial and imperfect, as with the exception of hunting animals in the forests, plucking wild fruits, and cutting a few trees to make canoes and houses. The natives did not, in any civilized sense, occupy the land. And so, well, the picture at the bottom is a little bit of an irony about occupying the land. This is a different way of occupying the land that he was promoting here. My own notion is that the particular circumstances which make the deliberate intrusion of a superior people into another country lawful or expedient are connected to some extent with the use which the dispossessed or conquered people have made of the soil. For instance, we might justify our occupation of Vancouver Island by the fact that all the land lying waste, the fact of all the land lying waste without prospect of improvement. Then I've done a little bit of work with Clan Chief Adam Dick and his home territory, the Tsawadeno, in the Kingcome River estuary, where his family for generations had root gardens, root plots at the mouth of the river. But in the Mckenna McBride Commission hearings in 1914, one of the chiefs from that community was testifying, and he talked about this man, McKay, who came and set up his farm right where the women used to get their roots. the women persisted to go to that place to get the food. This would be the Clover, silverweed, that's Argentina, Egedi, formerly Podentella pacifica, and rice root, northern rice root, they call it huquam, and Nootka lupin, Lupinus mckenna. Those are the 4 roots that grew in Adam's tequila. So each had a wooden spade, a yew wood digging stick, and a basket. The spade was to take up the roots, and the basket was to carry the roots. And these were taken from them and thrown away by this white man, and he immediately put a fence around the place, enclosing the place where our women used to get the food for the first time. Then we come to know the troubles that we're now in our own land, when the food of my people grew on that place. And he talks about how McKay also forbade them from coming to get their crab apples from the trees around the root garden, and essentially excluded them from what was legitimately and for millennia their source of food. And so just to kind of reinforce this, that all around British Columbia and beyond, people have these very close ties with their ecosystems. And not only have they shaped ecosystems, but the ecosystems have shaped the cultures and the economies, the values and beliefs. And you can see it in the art, you can see it in the ceremonies that people have had, even though those have been severely constrained in the recent decades, I guess centuries. And they used a very sophisticated kind of integrated method of caring for and maintaining their resources. So the root garden is just one example, but it was very closely tied with the crabapple trees, for example, and the high bush cranberries, further up the river with other kinds of berries, with thimbleberry sprouts, with salmonberries and bear and wolf and deer and geese and swans, and you could go on and on. Clam gardens, it all fit together in this amazing integrated system of food production. However, none of this was recognized really by the newcomers, and they saw people who were living in a backward way, in an uncivilized way, and therefore they set about to try to civilize them. And they did this through various means, through laws, through banning the potlatch, through banning the reef net fishery, which was a sustainable fishery, for ensuring that children were taken away from their families at a very young age, sometimes 3, 4, or 5, and put into residential schools. And essentially, they were trying to make those people just like themselves. They were really trying to reduce cultural diversity. And as a result, lost languages, lost oral traditions, ceremonies, people's identity was lost, and the knowledge about how to care for the land was lost. And as a consequence, ecosystems became degraded, and food systems and cultures became more similar to the general system of the Western newcomers. So of approximately 100 species of plant foods that people used, harvested traditionally and maintained, most today are not used anymore. And many of them, younger people in communities don't even know what they look like, or maybe don't even realize that their ancestors used those foods. And that was the case when we went into the kingdom. A lot of the younger people there of the Sawadena community didn't even know that those root gardens existed there in Adam's childhood days. And this is Dr. Mary Thomas, my dear friend, who passed away in 2007. So it's her generation, and especially people like Quetzalcoatl, our friend Clan Chief Adam Dick, who never went to residential school. There are a few people in every community like that who are very wealthy in terms of their knowledge and willing to share it, but those people are becoming fewer and fewer as the elders pass on. And it's very difficult to maintain that knowledge base that is part of that diversity. So there's been a lot written and a recognition of the importance of cultural diversity, even in the UNESCO Universal Declaration here. Cultural diversity is as necessary for humankind as biodiversity is for nature. And there are various other ways of expressing that. But diversity of languages, traditions, foodways, social organization, philosophies, and so forth, they're all very, very important, I think, to our long-term survival and to the Earth's survival. Here's a quote from famous linguist Hale, who himself could speak over 50 languages. The loss of local languages and of the cultural systems which they express has meant irretrievable loss of diverse and interesting intellectual wealth. Only with diversity can it be guaranteed that all avenues of human intellectual progress will be traveled. And so that comes to this whole notion of whole systems of knowledge that are held by cultural groups, peoples who speak their own languages, who live in their own territories, who depend on the resources of a given area. And a lot of this work has been done by my friend Vickert Burgess. This is one of my favorite pictures of Helen Clifton teaching her little granddaughter, Janelle, how to count halibut walks, the dried halibut. And that's a very common way of teaching children, is just having them participate in these activities, and they pick it all up. So you have different elements of traditional knowledge, worldview, practical strategies, ways of communicating and teaching, passing knowledge through generations, and social institutions and governance. And like biodiversity, cultural diversity also is enacted at different scales and over different kind of spheres or realms. And so the local knowledge of land, water, and plants is just one part. The actual attitudes and worldviews that people have in the social institutions they have to manage that are all an important part of people's culture. Especially the idea of kin-centricity, the notion that all the other species are our relatives, and we have responsibilities to them as we would to our own parents, grandparents, and children. They're generous relatives, but relatives. Learning, a lot of learning is done, as I say, from experience, your experiential learning, observation, and various kinds of formal teaching as well. How do you tell the difference between? It's just one little example of how learning takes place in this little song that is an imitation of the Swainson's thrush's song. He's talking about the different varieties of the salmonberries, because they say the Swainson's thrush is the one who's singing ripens the salmonberries. So he's talking about that. Come on, oh, you little dark ones. Come on, you little white ones. You little red ones. Come on, oh, you little yellow ones. Ripen, 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 ripen. And so children learn that, and they learn about the different varieties of salmonberries all at the same time, and they learn about the Swainson's thrush and how it always seems to appear just as the salmonberries are ripening. Just one example of many, and these are for Douglas. Just taxonomy is really important in all societies. It's the way we communicate about the variety of life. And so for the Git-Gat, this is Margaret Hill, and she is one of the few elders who knows the names for 5 or so different varieties of mollusks, the Pacific crabapple. She can distinguish them, and I have one of my master's students is working with her on trying to sort those out in the field. And the ways of learning, stories, songs, dances, feasts, potlatches, all of these, there's a dance that Adam has the authority to host the Atlagima dance, or the grouse dance, that he hosted at the university during the ethnobiology meetings a couple of years ago. And I told him it's like a complete course in forest ecology in an hour's performance, because they talk about all the different processes and the different diversity in a forest as they perform this dance. Sorry, I don't have time to go into it, but the institution's apprentice-type learning situations, and very collaborative and consultative. They're hereditary chiefs who make decisions, but they don't make them on their own. They consult with people about in a very respectful way. These are all things that I think all of us can learn from. They're ways that we can see how other people do things, and we might be able to improve our own way of making decisions in the world. For example, people have sanctions against killing trees unnecessarily, and so that's why they would harvest just a strip of cedar bark, but leave the tree living. And you can find trees all up and down the coast called CMTs, culturally modified trees, that have had a piece of bark or a slab of bark removed from them sometime in the past. Some of them go back 500 years. They're still living up on Haidawai and elsewhere. The same with birch trees. When you harvest birch bark to make a basket or a baby cradle like Mary Thomas used to do, you have to be really careful just to cut the outside part and peel it away so that you don't kill the tree. And as I said, I see today a lot of that richness of knowledge and practice and use and belief is disappearing as we're becoming more homogenized in the world. Our landscapes are looking more and more similar anywhere you go in the world. I had a zoology professor once who wouldn't sign a petition against whaling in the 1960s because he said, no, if the whales go extinct, it doesn't matter. All we need is cows and grass. I was floored by that. I won't name them. So you can take a photo of a sort of degraded farmland almost anywhere in the world, and it looks pretty much the same. And everywhere you go, you see this downward spiral degradation. Because we're following practices that aren't really sustainable. So we have to think about how we can do things differently. Obviously, not with all of our science and technology. There's something missing in what we're doing to the world. And it seems to come to governance, to ideas, to our attitudes and perceptions and values, rather than about any technical knowledge that we may or may not have. And this is where some other cultures in the world, we can learn from them. We can maybe gain some of their wisdom and use that wisdom in a way that really serves not just ourselves, but the environment in general. We need a lot more participation of people with different ideas, different values in our decision-making processes. We have to think about the cultural, even spiritual dimensions of diversity, and not just think about the utilitarian dimensions, or even ecosystem services. It's more than that. We have services we should be giving to ecosystems, I think. Here's what Gujau, the president of the Council of the Haida Nation, or has been, I'm not sure, he's stepped down at this point, but any destruction that occurs to the soil, water, earth, or air of Haida degrades at the very being of what a Haida is. We would become like everyone else. We're part of the environment. Every inspiration is of this landscape. Everything is what we are. We think of ourselves in that way. I think we would behave differently. And Mary Thomas, I heard a lot of my elders, so this would be 100 years ago or so, talk about the spirituality, and they would say that we as human beings are not superior to Mother Nature's creation. We are only a strand in it. And what we do to the environment, we do to ourselves, and those are the things, I guess, that really got me into what I'm doing today. She's a wonderful educator, received an honorary degree from our university for her work. And we can take some of these ideas, and it's not too late to reverse our activities and to restore and to bring back not just the ecosystems, but also the cultural knowledge that goes with it. There's still people out there who can help us do that. So that's the message I'd like to leave you with, that we have to think of the complexity of it all and acknowledge that. But I think traditional ecological knowledge systems can enhance our understanding of species and ecosystems. We can gain from learning about different values and attitudes that influence our behaviors. And for our survival as humans, we need to maintain and celebrate diversity, both biological and cultural. So biocultural diversity. There's a few references which I'll be happy to share with you. I'm not going to read them out, but there's been quite a bit of thinking in this area of biocultural diversity. And Louisa Maffei with Terralingua is one of the people who's really promoted it, as well as Victor Burgess and Carl Folke and others. More locally, Frank and Kathy Brown from the Heiltsuk Nation with other First Nations have written about the importance of biodiversity stewardship and sustainability. And even my friend Doug Durr and I edited a book called Keeping It Living that talks about some of these things. I've had several graduate students who've been working in this area, and one is Lee Joseph, who completed their master's this last year, working on Chris's favorite plant, Fritillaria capsutensis, with her own home nation, the Squamish Nation, bringing it back to a place where it used to grow in abundance and was disappeared because of industrial development on the south side of the Squamish estuary. Now she's working with the youth in her community to bring it back, just as one example. And there is the Global Diversity Foundation, of which I'm a member, and my friend Dr. Gary Martin, who's the founding director of this foundation, has been working really hard all around the world to promote this idea of biocultural diversity, which he just calls diversity. You have plenty to think about right here with your own botanical garden and all the things that you can do to support the garden's work to promote biocultural diversity. I think you're doing a wonderful job. Thank you.